Buckle in. It's a long story.
This is the first giant crossover event.
My first impression of Crisis was, this is awesome, give me more. It was this doorway to worlds that I didn't really know.
Infinite Earths.
There had never been a maxi series this large. There had never been a story that was that important to the entire comic company.
For us to try to tackle it in animation was nuts.
It really is the most modern, impactful series that was ever created.
You know what you have to do, mate. Clear the board and start again. One reality. One timeline.
Crisis on Infinite Earths was one of the first maxi series back in the day, came out 1985. This was the first of its kind, really. There weren't these big crossover events that now regularly drive interest and sales in the marketplace today.
Crisis was going to cross over into the books as Crisis was coming out, and we'd never done that before. In a lot of ways, we were setting precedents, and we were paving pathways.
It's the first, it's the best, and it invented so many different parts of modern-day comic books and comic book language. It made the multiverse a big word.
It really blew my mind. This idea of parallel Earths that were infinite, where we were all represented in slightly different ways. The DC Universe felt infinite.
The first time you open Crisis on Infinite Earths, it's almost too much. There are hundreds of characters that you know, and hundreds of characters that you have no idea who they are. But it's also extremely inviting because it's not just a hero, it's a world of superheroes.
Nobody had ever done something like this, and it actually came together that everything made sense. Every T was crossed, every I was dotted, every emotion that we could milk out of the characters came out.
When Crisis actually started coming out, people were more receptive to the fact that it was so packed with story.
When the initial sales came in on the first handful of issues, it became apparent this was a big success.
Crisis on Infinite Earths invented the mega crossover. It invented the reboot. It invented the retconning.
It's a massive, massive undertaking. This was an event that was going to essentially redefine the present and future of the DC Universe. Marv Wolfman, for my generation, was on par with Stan Lee. When I grew up reading comics, there was a number of prominent people, but no one like Stan. And that kind of changed in the mid-'80s. DC really had a renaissance publishing stuff for older readers. Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, and then Crisis on Infinite Earths. Marv really brought the flair developed at Marvel over to DC.
One of the things that makes Marv one of the best comic book writers in history is his love for what he does, his love for the characters and stories that he creates.
To him, it's all about the character, not the spectacle. And the daunting challenge for him was, how do you take Crisis and ground it in the humanity of what was about to happen?
He knows who these characters are emotionally, what they react to, what they're going to be motivated by, and it makes us care about them. That's why I love his writing.
Our canon is incredibly complicated, and it's a beautiful point, but it was considered to be off-putting to new readers.
I was writing the answers to the letter columns, and a fan wrote in saying, the DC continuity and the history is so confusing, I don't know what to make of it. What can you do? And I answered, well, one of these days we should figure out something. I had worked out the whole concept of the series, not all the details, but how it would basically function. And it was all to solve that one problem.
How do you condense 50 years of storytelling and to compile all the characters and to make sure that they're somehow represented?
It doesn't get any bigger than the idea of Crisis on Infinite Earths. I don't envy what he had to do to try and pull it all together and still have everything have weight.
What Marv would have had to do in order to properly do a 12-issue Maxi series like this is research. There were so many different Earths, all these different versions of Batman and all these different versions of Superman.
And the idea that you're going to tell a story with all of them and then try to explain and figure out where they're going to go, there couldn't be a greater writing challenge.
Marv knew all these characters because he used to work in the DC offices back in the 60s. So if anyone was going to be capable of writing this, it really would have only been Marv.
I don't envy Marv's job of taking 50 years of DC continuity and jamming it into 12 issues, but I certainly relate to it. What a tremendous challenge he had to do that, and what a great idea to really start fresh.
When I was just starting out as a professional, very young, I was working at DC as an intern. My lunch hours was spent in the DC library reading every comic from 1938 on. So I actually knew all the history of DC from having read them. I read all the characters and I knew what they were, so I could keep them straight in my head.
Having worked on a number of universe-wide event epic projects as a publisher and helping organize it, it is a massive, massive undertaking.
How do you properly kill off characters? How do you write a series with that level of scope and scale? It's basically like a masterclass in how to do that.
The hard part was coming up with the plot, because you have to make it cohesive to the fans. DC very amazingly, kindly let me take a few years to work out the plot. So I broke it down into 3 4-issue chapters, issue 4 and issue 7. They're the ends of major plot lines, because there was no template for this. I had to make it up as I went along. And I figured if I started on a small level, we could build each section going from that point on.
I was a big fan of George Perez when I was a kid. I can see some of his influences on my own art.
George was always an enthusiastic comic fan first. It clearly had to come from the heart.
You could see it in every line he puts down on the page, and he loves all those characters.
It only could possibly work if you had an artist like George Perez lined up, because he wants to draw everybody.
Another artist presenting a story that has 400 characters in it would have said, oh, can you bring it down to like 5? George would say, can you bring that up to 600 characters? 700 characters? He loved drawing that.
I've tried to do it 3 or 4 times. It's a bear. Like, you're doing this guy. Why did I sign up for this assignment? This is insane. And he had to do that not just once, but every single issue for 12 issues in a row. He brought the same level of depth and focus to everything he drew, and that mattered as a fan, that this artist was going all out and, basically killing himself, drawing all these incredibly complex images.
And that's kind of really why ultimately he's the only guy that could have ever done Crisis.
When you are drawing this many characters, each of these people, each of these superheroes has their own motivations, how they stand and how they hold themselves and what they would do in a fight situation. George would have to know, is one person taller than the other? How do they look when they stand in a group?
He designed his characters based on their personalities and their power sets so that they stood out.
George created a world that was hyper real. You could see every brick on the wall. You could see every button on every costume.
It's a believable world that I understand, but at the same time, he's inserted these larger-than-life characters. You can believe that there's a world where the Teen Titans are walking around Manhattan and no one bats an eye at their costumes.
George had big ideas and big action, but managed to do it in a lot of smaller panels that were densely packed that gave it a different sense and feel.
The number of panels, they're so small and so tiny, but have to explain so much, not just about universes changing and collapsing and worlds dying, but to introduce sometimes to new readers a character for just a panel or two and have them have significance that matches what an old reader would feel for them. It's just a masterwork.
Now, George was not signed up for Crisis, but We would talk about it because we were still on Titans, and we would talk about it because we were friends. I'm telling him where I am currently with the Crisis storyline, and he said, I want to draw it. And I said, yes.
I had the privilege and honor to work with George. I experienced just a little bit of George's passion and interest. He wanted everyone to have a moment. He added a whole layer of storytelling.
He could fill up a panel with 1,000 characters and backgrounds and all this stuff, and there'd still be plenty of room for me to write my dialogue. There was always the room for the story, because that's what he was concerned with as well.
He can do a 12-panel page, and it does not feel like a 12-panel page. It's just storytelling, but he spotlights the character so you can see these close-ups.
He was able to wring all the emotion out of each page and each grouping of characters, which all I could do was just try to not screw it up.
George's influence continues to this day. The double-page spread, which has every single superhero flying at you, the poses really represent the essence of the characters themselves.
He was the only artist who could bring all of that together. When he so sadly passed away far too early, almost every artist said George's love for comics and his love for drawing is why the fans loved him, and they all were talking about trying to figure out how that could apply to their art. He has a lasting impact because of that.
Mainstream comics is an interesting medium in that generally the work is collaborative. Writer and artist, they're different disciplines, but you are creating something that you can't create on your own. Marv Wolfman and George Perez's work together really defined that era's pinnacle work for mainstream superhero comics.
It was lightning in a bottle for these guys. Marv had plenty of successes as a writer outside of working with George, but nothing is going to overshadow Crisis and Teen Titans.
For DC, Wolfman Perez is the gold standard. Marv saw George's talents as more than just an artist. He saw him as a storyteller. He encouraged him to write. The two of them were deep, deep lovers of characters and comics.
I was a fan of George Perez and Marv Wolfman. Teen Titans was a great run of books.
The original Teen Titans were all the sidekicks. Teen Titans need to introduce new characters. And I think they also wanted to diversify the cast and have more troubled or complex characters. They were very smart in how they designed the team and who they created and added to the mix.
As George got to draw them and get to know them as characters and working off what Marv was plotting out for them, George was discovering not just how they interacted with one another, but what made them tick, what made them human. Marv and George suddenly were hitting on all cylinders.
They had that time to establish their relationship on Titans as master storytellers. They were able to introduce Harbinger and Monitor in Titans so that when you got to Crisis, it actually feels momentous. It doesn't feel like you're just dropping characters in.
What's interesting about their collaboration, they creatively meshed. George's influence wasn't limited to just the pencils and the art he was creating.
I'd come in with the rough plot, and then we'd work out the specifics together. We decided up front, if one of us disagreed with the other, whatever it was, we'd just say, okay, we'll forget that, we'll come up with something new together.
It really was this crazy collaborative thing. Nobody in comics could have done that level of interactive storytelling.
Once you find a collaborator where you're both excited and motivated to tell the same kind of story the same way, you start to learn each other's language because you're speaking to each other through script and art.
The visuals for the death of Flash or the Supergirl, they had a style and a feel of their own that I don't think you would have gotten if it had been typed up exactly what was supposed to happen.
It made for a much better collaboration where you have two people who respect each other and are going to work to get a better book.
Everything felt authentic, everything felt like it mattered, everything paid respect both to the stories and to the creative teams that came before.
The combination of Marv and George really ushered in a new age for DC in terms of the storytelling, the look and feel of what a DC comic should be. That still continues to resonate and lead even today.
Barry? Go back to the beginning, Bruce. To before the beginning. You must. It's the only way.
Adapting Crisis into other mediums is extremely difficult. And that's one of the joys of comic books. You can make these massive scale things with a bajillion characters and massive fight scenes. Because there's no budget, the only limitation is the imagination of the writer and the artist.
Dinosaurs stampede in downtown Metropolis.
Animation has faced the same problem that the comic books creators had, which is you have to create and invest and build these characters up. So this is a multi-year process of building this world and these universes in order to be able to destroy them and piece them apart. The adaptation of this is as great a challenge as George and Marv faced back in the 80s.
We had the opportunity to pitch to them both how we were going to adapt it. And you can imagine how nerve-wracking that is, because we took some characters like Harbinger and Pariah and did twists on them so that they would be characters that we knew and cared about.
Still enough juice to pull off a cleanup spell.
And they loved it. They were so positive about it. It was a real honor.
It's releasing some kind of energy, like the waves. It's antimatter.
Oh, God. Working on the animated version to try to do justice to what they did in the comic is next to impossible.
The biggest difficulty was the sheer volume of the characters that we had to put on screen, which for animation is so time-consuming.
This took it to another level, 10 times the characters that we were used to doing.
There are a lot of characters that don't have lines, but are in this movie because they are part of the DC universe and the history of DC.
We really enjoyed trying to hit on some of the original covers, trying to hit on some of the original scenes.
It's no good. We're not getting through.
Or trying to mirror one of those scenes, but maybe it's not the exact same character. There were a few that I really liked that I thought were very effective in giving the Crisis so much gravitas.
It's okay. I should have died with Krypton. Every moment then has been bonus time. I love
you. Superman, he knows that if she didn't do it, he was going to do it. So she basically saved him, and I think that that's a really good way to go with the story.
The death of Supergirl, it really was a lot of fun to pull those shots off, especially with what the original artist had done.
Taking what George and Marv did and turning it into animation, the thing it does is give you a huge respect for what they did, because it's really huge. For the rest of my life, when I reread Crisis, I'm gonna respect the attempt at every corner to include as many characters as possible and to give them a story, whether it's a long arc or 3 panels. There's a reason they're there, and I wish we had 3 panels for every character in this movie.
I usually dispense justice. Perhaps this time, I can offer hope.
Crisis has resonated because the love comes through. If you care about the characters, you're going to write a scene that the fans are going to look at and never forget.
The word crisis is woven into DC lore and has continued to evolve and shape the DC universe almost 40 years later.
It stands the test of time because it's undeniably good, and it's undeniably original for its time and for now.
It has been an honor. I hope we meet again.
All the things that built up to Crisis, they all still exist. Crisis didn't erase it. It all really happened. It just meant a fresh start. And that's what'll happen here, too.
What happens to me in there? Superman will be there, and part of him will be you.
And that's all I need to know. See you on the other side.